Good morning. I'm going to begin this press conference. This is a joint press conference that the mayor and I have been doing since the pandemic and these more limited press conferences. As you know, before a legislative meeting, I have a press conference where I report on the issues that are coming up for the legislative meeting the next day. Tomorrow, Tuesday, June 9th, the council will have its regular legislative meeting for the month of June, although the agenda is not very large in terms of number of measures. So I'm going to speak to this, take any questions, and then I will turn it over to the mayor with her usual press conference, and I will be staying for a while in case there are more questions regarding the council's business. The main items for tomorrow's legislative meeting are we are approving final reading on the temporary coronavirus legislation. That was a very comprehensive bill that we adopted at our last meeting. This was a consolidation of, I'm going to say, 4 or 5 different bills that had been passed periodically since March 17th with regard to measures in the district to try to help with the economy, as well as stability for individuals, as well as employment for residents, and so forth. I'm not going to go over what all those measures were, and actually I don't have that list in front of me, but we have the temporary legislation which will put that in place for 225 days, as well as an emergency that will make some additional clarifications with regard to some measures such as the limitations on the percentage fee commission that can be charged by third-party delivery services that was eating into restaurants' revenue, some clarifications regarding tenant payment plans, the micro-grant program, the rent freeze, which we adopted on March 17th. There are some new measures in tomorrow's emergency. One is creating a new public health emergency response grant program at the request of the executive, which would give grants for increasing awareness of COVID and promoting prevention. So that's an executive sponsored provision. Another new measure will be modifying ABRA rules. That's called Beverage Regulation Administration. Modifying ABRA rules to allow for the increased outdoor dining and related alcohol purchases on public space. So that's to try to help with restaurants with the reopening. And then we will be legislatively approving the symbolic designation of Black Lives Matter Plaza, and we will be approving a contract that Events DC is entering into that will finally get the dollars out for undocumented workers. You may remember that Events DC over a month ago approved roughly $15 million, $5 million for restaurants, $5 million for hotels, and $5 million for undocumented workers. And where that lies at this point is a contract to disperse the dollars to undocumented workers, and that contract will be before us for approval tomorrow. It would be passively approved on a slower track, and we want to see it approved more quickly. So that's in the coronavirus emergency bill that we have tomorrow. There is, in addition, emergency bills, one from Councilmember Robert White, Emergency Credit Alert, which deals with the use of credit reports for individuals for whom there may be a payment plan, which is not an adverse action on or an adverse matter on a credit report, but still we want to limit the how that information can be used. So that's Mr. White's emergency. Councilmember Bonds will have an emergency also dealing with some housing aspects. They're fairly technical, and we're going to be combining those with the coronavirus emergency bill I just spoke with. Councilmembers Che, Nadeau, and Allen have an emergency they've noticed called the Connected Transportation Network Emergency Amendment Act, and that bill attempts to take a program already announced by the Department of Transportation to use public space for alternatives, which could be for business use, but it also could be for bicycling or for more recreational space, given the needs for social distancing. And So there's that program in place from DOT, but this bill would codify some of that as well as require a reporting on what exactly DDOT is doing so that we can see that we're actually dedicating on a temporary basis, which is actually maybe 3/4 of a year, dedicating some public space for non-vehicular uses. And then the final emergency was noticed by Councilmember Charles Allen, and it is called the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Emergency Amendment Act, and it proposes a number of provisions putting into law prohibition on the use of neck restraints, changing the law with regard to access to body-worn camera video recordings, for instance, requiring MPD to preserve body-worn camera recordings related to a council request or investigation. I'm not going to go into each of the measures here unless I'm asked, but it would instill greater accountability with regard to that camera footage. The bill proposes some changes to the Office of Police Complaints Board, including allowing the executive director of the Office of Police Complaints to investigate evidence of abuse or misuse of police powers that the office identifies, even though it may not have been specifically alleged in the complaint which initiated their investigation. There's a proposal to expand the membership of the Use of Force Review Board, which is an existing board. There's a provision to extend the time for corrective or adverse action against an MPD officer in serious cases, which right now by statute is limited to 90 days, and this would give a greater period of time for taking adverse action, corrective or adverse action. The legislation would repeal a anti-mask law that is currently in the code. The bill would require certain procedural safeguards where there is a consent search initiated by the police. I'll read a little bit from the notice here. Strengthens procedural justice in cases where a police officer's search of a person or their vehicle, home, or property is based only on the person's consent to the search. The officer would have to explain that the person is being asked to consent and that they can refuse the search. And then there is a provision dealing with mandatory continuing education and reconstituting the Police Officer Standards and Training Board. The POST Board, Police Officer Standards and Training Board, was a reform adopted by the council in the late 1990s, possibly early 2000s, and it has become dormant, and it is a way of trying to maintain rigorous standards for police officers. And there is a provision regarding identification of MPD officers during First Amendment assemblies as local law enforcement. And then there are a few measures that are unrelated to the police. I believe repeal of law enforcement reporting requirement for crime victims' compensation, which is a precondition to a victim that they have to file a police report before they can apply for victims' compensation. There's a measure that would restore or enfranchise individuals serving felony sentences with the vote, and a Department of Corrections home confinement evaluation requirement that I believe tracks the CARES Act. I expect there'll be quite a bit of discussion on this measure tomorrow. And I've circulated notice of 4 amendments I'll be proposing, one which is prohibiting police discipline from being a negotiable matter in a collective bargaining agreement, and prohibiting the hiring of officers who have a history of misconduct in other jurisdictions, and strengthening Office of Police Complaints access to MPD records when they have an investigation. So in a nutshell, those are the issues before the council tomorrow. I'm happy to take questions, and then I'll turn it over to the mayor. Martin.
I mean, other than the amendments you're proposing to make to Councilmember Allen's bill. Do you have any general thoughts on what's in there? Do you support what he already has in the bill? Do you think it goes far enough? Do you think it needs to go further?
I support the legislation and I expect it will be passed. I expect there will be some debate over some of the more technical aspects of the bill. Some of these issues are a little bit more complex than is often thought in the public discourse. But, and I also think that, or I'm aware that there are a lot of suggestions right now circulating in the public realm with regard to reforms that that cities need to adopt. What many people don't realize is that this is not the first time that the district has dealt with issues of police conduct, and that we've actually made quite a number of reforms over the last several decades. If I remember correctly, and I was not briefed on this, there was concern about 10 years ago with regard to the use of deadly force, and that there was an investigation, and that there were some reforms adopted at that time. And I say that only to say that while we need to continually review and evaluate whether procedures that we have and requirements that we have are adequate, there's already been quite a bit that has been adopted in the district. So Mr. Allen's proposals are necessary and useful, but they may not go as far as what we are hearing being demanded of police departments across the country, but that could be because we've already done a lot of that. For example, one of the demands that I've heard is that there needs to be independent consideration of complaints by citizens of police conduct. Well, we've had a very robust police complaints board for over 20 years. Bennett.
Chairman Mendelson, were there any police reform ideas that couldn't pass with the 2015-2016 legislation that are being revisited now?
I don't remember what would have not made it 5 years ago. In fact, as I'm standing here, you would have to refresh me on what was adopted in 2015, unless you're talking about the NEAR Act.
NEAR Act. And
yeah.
The body camp, but it was part of NEAR Act too, right?
I don't think it was. It may have been. I think some of that was separate. I remember that the mayor proposed a body-worn cameras separate from the NEAR Act.
The question is, was there anything that couldn't make it into the NEAR Act that you think now with the political conditions can pass now?
I do believe that the political climate is different today. So one of the provisions that I mentioned I'm going to move as an amendment has to do with OPC, that's Office of Police Complaints, access to police records. That actually was taken from legislation about 10 years ago that the mayor, when she was a council member, and I co-introduced that I think has a good chance of passing now. I mean, it's a fairly simple change, but it makes it clear that OPC has unfettered access to relevant records. Martin?
What do you think about the kind of the bigger call being made out there to defund the police? And what do you make of it? Do you support it? Do you think there's any value to kind of starting that discussion?
I think that when we talk about the demand for defunding the police, we need to be clear what that means. Does that mean really reducing the budget of the police department to zero? We have to remember that as much as there's been attention on issues of police misconduct, very legitimate concerns about police misconduct, actually some very heinous issues with regard to police misconduct, that police also serve a very important function with regard to crime. And so what I think what the council is going to look to do is look at whether additional dollars can be found for increasing alternatives, which is something the council initiated with the NEAR Act to look at non-traditional policing strategies toward reducing crime and responding to crime. Looking at crime as often a public health issue, and looking at recognizing that crime often has I'm going to say, cyclical aspect to it, meaning that what we see with a lot of the shootings that occur is that somebody is shot, then there's retaliation, then there's retaliation to the retaliation, cyclical in that sense. So the NEAR Act went to that approach, and we've expanded that in the last couple of years, and I think that's what the council is going to look to do with the budget before us, is to put more emphasis on that. I would add that we also have to keep in mind that really the fundamental issue is, I think, that has been in the public debate for the last 10 days, has been not whether there should be a police response to crime, but rather police misconduct, and how police can be better at serving the citizens whom they're supposed to be serving and protecting. Sophie?
To go off that, you said something like, when it comes to the defund police conversation, you're going to be looking at alternatives. What I think part of that conversation is taking money from the police to fund those alternatives. Is that something you're considering?
I'm sure that the council members will be looking at that as a possibility.
Mayor Bowser, do you support the bill as currently written, and what would you like to see added or taken out?
I'm going to speak down to the chair.
Yeah, why don't we have her come up when she comes up. Are there any other questions for me with regard to the legislative meeting tomorrow or the issues on the agenda?
Anything you want to see taken out?
Anything I
the
want to
police
see?
bill. Any provisions in the police bill that you want to see taken out or removed?
As I indicated, I've noticed 4 amendments to add. I'm not looking to strike anything from that bill. And I would also note that the bill is before us on an emergency basis. That means it would be in effect for 90 days. There'll be a temporary accompanying it, which will be in effect for longer, and then there will be work on permanent legislation. So I think that there'll be some technical aspects that will get refined as we get to the permanent legislation, but substantively, I expect that I would be surprised if there were any substantive provisions that were removed from the bill. Just because of the nature of our structure of government, the council is in a position where it can respond fairly quickly to events like this, doing legislation that you would see in other states when the legislature finally gets around to being able to meet and to adopt. We're able to respond more quickly. And I think that the work that Mr. Allen has put forward reflects the expertise that is in the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety with regard to ideas.
Is this happening too quickly, though? Because there haven't been any hearings held on this sweeping legislation, or is the idea that the committee's already been working through these issues for years and can jump on it now?
Well, I'm suggesting the latter, but I also think that some of the provisions actually track requirements that are in the general orders. Maybe refine them a little bit, but some of it is not new, but it is being codified, and there's a value to that because then it's a matter of legal policy of the government as opposed to just simply something in a general order that could be changed. But some of the provisions, like for instance, the prohibition on neck holds. I'm not really sure that a deliberative process adds anything there. So I'll still be here for questions if there are more. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C. I want to thank Chairman Mendelson for being here and participating in a joint presser, which I think is efficient for all of us. And I know that he and the council are working hard and continuing to support our COVID response in their legislative meetings, so we appreciate that. I want to provide and invite Chief Newsham up to provide a quick public safety update as it relates to the district's response to demonstrations in our city, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Thanks for your continued leadership. Yesterday marked the 10th straight day of protests here in Washington, D.C. As anticipated, this weekend we experienced the largest crowds, particularly on Saturday, that we've seen so far. There were tens of thousands of peaceful demonstrators in the city. In fact, I heard on the radio when I was driving in that the protests were described as being largely without violence. I would correct that statement and say exclusively without violence. I will go through the arrests over the course of the last several days. Last Saturday, we had 19 arrests. Sunday, we had 90. Monday, we had 289. Tuesday, 29. Wednesday, we had 0 arrests. Thursday, we had 0 arrests. This past Friday, we had 1 arrest for a simple assault. On Saturday, we had 1 arrest for an attempted burglary of an establishment in the area of the protests. And then on Sunday, in the early morning, we had a defacing property arrest. So we anticipate more demonstrations as the days move forward throughout this week. And we stand prepared to facilitate the peaceful demonstrations that we've seen in recent days. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Yes.
What are your thoughts on the Councilmember Allen's bill for the police reform?
We will be going through it section by section today and discuss any changes or additions that we think we need with the council member. I think by and large so far, the preliminary briefings that I've received is that we can largely be supportive, but we want to make sure we understand all the technicalities. Yes.
Are you satisfied with the withdrawal of the Maryland and New Jersey National Guard forces, and are there any other forces that need to go? And along those lines, have you established a new sort of standard operating procedure with the National Guard so they make sure to inform you before their forces show up on your street?
We understand that all of the out-of-state guard will be leaving the city. If they're not already gone, would have been gone within 48 hours, I think, from yesterday. I had another meeting with General Walker over the weekend, I believe that was, where we discussed a number of issues about the DC Guard. Keep in mind that the DC Guard is a federal guard. We have called up members of the DC Guard to help us with both COVID response and with demonstration response including both over the last couple of months. And so we will continue to have those discussions with General Walker. Our Congresswoman has a bill before Congress that would change the organizational structure of the DC National Guard, which we support. Any other questions? Yes, Bennett.
Mayor Bowser, one of the big complaints that we've been hearing from activists over the weekend is in regards to the city's policies with body-worn camera footage. Is the program working as intended when there are families of people who've been killed by police who haven't been able to view that footage?
Well, we are certainly think that the body-worn camera program works. I think you recognize, I guess it's 2015 now, we were, I think, the first jurisdiction in the country to have a body-worn camera program for all patrol officers. There's been, we commissioned our own study, we studied it, the effectiveness, what impact does the body-worn camera program have on police activity? What does it have on citizen activity? How does it correlate to complaints that we see? We've done all of that. We rolled it out, in fact, in such a way that we could study half of our officers. Half of them had it, half were part of a control group to see if we noticed any differences in behavior, and we've shared that information and everything that we learned. There was also a pretty robust conversation about all of the rules related to body-worn camera, which were, I think, unanimously approved by the council. So we think that the program is working.
What's the plan for how long you're going to keep the Black Lives Matter mural on 16th Street?
Well, we've commissioned the artwork. We renamed the plaza, and I'm thankful to the council for codifying that renaming to Black Lives Matter Plaza. We think it's going to have a central place, not in just DC history, but in American history, and we should be proud of it.
Does the plan to just keep it there for years?
We haven't discussed how long it's going to stay there, but it, like all of our other public art, it stays. And so we will continue to talk about ways to make that a part of the fabric of DC. And we also want to involve our downtown district, involved the neighbors to the mural, and we will do that.
What about your plans for the part that was added that says defund police?
Well, it's not a part of the mural. It wasn't part of the commission, but we recognize it as expression, and especially right now, acknowledging and affirming expression is important to this discussion that we have to have as a community.
Are you planning to take it off or remove it?
Well, I do not consider it as part of the mural. Any other questions?
At the center of the press release from Black Lives Matter, they listed the individuals Jeffrey Price, Daquan Young, Marquise Alston, Terrence Sterling, Raphael Briscoe, and a number of others who were killed by MPD and are still looking to get answers about, their families are still looking to get answers about their deaths. What do you say to those families, and why have their questions gone unanswered?
I don't know that I could agree that the questions have gone unanswered, but certainly MPD is available to answer any questions and to show any body-worn camera to family members. Yes.
This one could actually be for the chief, since he's been here for a while and probably seen a lot of police reform efforts. Is something different about now than what happened, I think it was almost 2 decades ago, when DOJ got involved and there was use of force issues, a lot of reforms were proposed? I mean, is this a different moment? Do you think DC went through, what DC went through 2 decades ago is what some police departments are now starting to go through across the country, or?
I think that's a great question, Martin. I'm going to turn to the chief and also build on something we heard from the chairman. The chief just gave me the date upstairs that it was 2002 when we entered into a number of agreements with the federal government. And we've been on the pace of reforming our department for the last 18 years. We've had the commitment of wonderful police leadership, and so while I don't know if I would totally agree with your characterization, this department is different than many places in the country because of that steady pace of reform over the last 18 years. But let me introduce the chief, who's been here for every one of those years, to talk about it.
Thank you, Mayor, and the chairman, and you are absolutely right. We have been on a path to reform for policing in Washington, D.C. since 2002. For those of you who were here prior to 2002, you'll remember a series of articles about the Metropolitan Police Department that came out in 1999, where they painted the Metropolitan Police Department as using more excessive force, shooting more rounds, poor investigations, everything soup to nuts, which painted MPD in a negative light. The Department of Justice was called in by Chief Ramsey to take a look at the agency, and they determined that the Metropolitan Police Department had a pattern and practice of using excessive force. In 2002, we entered into a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Justice. It took us several years to come into substantial compliance. An independent monitor was assigned. In fact, that independent, after we had come into substantial compliance, that independent monitor was asked by the council to come back and take a look to see if the Metropolitan Police Department had slipped back on any of those initiatives. What the independent monitor said at that time was the Metropolitan Police Department, particularly its leadership, was committed to fair, unbiased, and constitutional policing. That is something we are very proud of. We have discussed the legislation, the emergency legislation that has been proposed. Other than some technical issues with it, with some of the asks, a lot of the items that are in the emergency legislation are already in the MPD general orders, so that will be essentially making those under they will legislate those into becoming law here in the city. To the extent that we have concerns, we will talk to Councilmember Allen. We will talk to the chairman, and hopefully, because this is being done so quickly under an emergency procedure, that we can get legislation that everybody in the city is comfortable with. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
This either for the mayor.
Oh, you know what? Can I answer? Because you had said that since we've had the body-worn cameras, that families have not been able to review body-worn camera. That is just not true. In every instance where there has been a fatal use of force in the District of Columbia, the families have been able to view the video.
What about the complaints from the mother of Marquise Alston?
Marquise Alston's family has been able to view the video, and I want to say on 2 separate occasions.
Yes.
To what do you or Chief Newsham attribute the fall in violence and arrests? Was it because you directed police not to forcibly enforce the curfews, and when they were enforced, and signal to the protesters that you were backing them, or at least their cause?
I'm not a public safety official, but I'm going to give you my gut reaction. And that is, for a couple of nights, there was a critical mass of people here that were bent on destruction. After Monday, when we saw federal forces move on American people, there was a critical mass of people who were bent on making sure that would never happen again. And the people who were bent on destruction were outnumbered and probably left. Yes.
I asked this to you before, but the protests, the main goal of them is to defund the police. What are your thoughts on that? The chairman said that some council members will look to take funding from police and move it to alternatives. So what is your reaction to that?
Well, I have my budget that I submitted to the council a few weeks ago, and I can tell you that what we have submitted is what we think we need for public safety. Not a penny more and not a penny less. And I mean that on both the enforcement side for the Metropolitan Police Department, and I also know that we have heavily invested in intervention programs, opportunity programs as well, which has always been our approach. Our approach is policing, intervention, and opportunity. And over the course of my time in office, I think now this is our 6th budget, over the last 5 years, in fact, if you look at the percent change in our investments, you can see that MPD has increased more slowly than those social service agencies, for example. And we saw a 12% change in investments in MPD since 2015. DHS, our Department of Human Services, has seen a 75% change. Likewise, for schools, both DCPS and Public Charter has seen a 40% change. DHCF, which handles a lot of our health programs, has seen a 21% change. DBH, that handles our mental health programs, has seen a 15% change. The Office of Victim Services in the last 5 years has seen a 90% increase in funding. So I just want to be very clear that the budgets that we have sent to the council over the last 5 years has recognized all parts of public safety, policing, but certainly intervention and opportunity programs.
Chief Newsham, you said on the radio over the weekend that a decrease in funding to police would increase police violence. Could you expand upon that?
No, I don't know if I exactly said that. What I would say is that I think, and I talked about this a little bit before, where you saw the Metropolitan Police Department in the 90s when they determined that we had a pattern and practice of excessive force. I think that can be attributed to not having the proper funding for the agency. And I think if you look at agencies that have run into similar problems, underfunding or inappropriate funding would be one of the reasons why they got themselves into that position. Funding is required for training. It's required for recruitment and hiring of the best people, people who are service-minded and look at this job in that regard. When you talk about training, cultural competency, implicit bias, de-escalation, those things are things that we fund here in Washington, D.C. Those are things that we are very proud of an agency. And our ears are all wide open with regards to accountability. The mayor did mention this. One of the reasons that all of the police officers on the streets of the District of Columbia wear body-worn cameras is because of accountability. And we have been all ears to that. You have had a membership, the FOP, that represents the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department, who were receptive to that type of accountability in their agency. And to the extent that any legislation moving forward helps us with accountability, with improving our police department, our ears are wide open.
Okay, is that it? Great, thank you, everybody.